so nice to see you again. And one of the things that I've been thinking a lot about is what's been going wrong with our sense making. What are the assumptions that we're making that aren't helping us to understand the world, or getting and actively getting in the way of us sort of understanding what's going on today? And I think one of those things that's sort of embedded in the culture, that's been there for a while, that sort of people are acting as if, is this idea that knowledge is power, and therefore more knowledge is always better. Which I think, you know, the second part is fair if the first part is true. But as I pointed out in previous videos, so, you know, particularly my video on power, power isn't what you think. It doesn't work the way people sort of couch it. And we'll have to dig in a little bit to what is knowledge, and what can knowledge do, and what is knowledge not able to do for us? What are the things that we say, if we have knowledge, we can't do with it, or the things that we assume that knowledge sort of inherently gives us? And so today I'd like to talk a little bit about knowledge. Now, these are going to be my definitions to some extent, right? But I'm trying to draw on things like how people use words, what they mean when they say words. Those might be two different things, by the way. And then what they're intending to convey to you, and maybe what the words actually mean, right? So sometimes we get information and we make different assumptions out of it. But again, these are sort of my conceptions and my terminology and my definitions. If you like it, cool, use it. I'll never know. If you don't like it, cool, don't use it. I'll never know. Or better yet, modify it to suit your own needs. So the problem with knowledge is that knowledge isn't one thing, and it's sort of hard to identify. And then John Vervaeke talks a lot about the 4 P's of knowing, which are propositional. I make a statement, you know, the sky is blue. That's propositional knowledge. I've given it to you. You've taken the proposition, or maybe not. You don't have to take propositions. That's one type of knowledge. Procedural, which in John Vervaeke's scheme is skills and skill sets and things like that. Then there's participatory, the knowledge of how you participate with other people. And then his last one is perspectival, which is sort of your take on the situation, where you're coming from, your understanding of that framing. My conception of this is a little bit different, but I don't think it matters to some extent, right? Because the important part is there's more than one way in which we know something. There's more than one type of understanding we have of things in the world, per se. So, well, you might say, well, wow, that's confusing. It can be. And, you know, what good is this? So the type of knowledge you have while riding a bike, while you can translate it using language into, say, procedural and propositions like, you know, keep your balance and pedal your feet and hold on to the handlebars and turn when you want to turn, right? You can make that into propositional knowledge, but actually riding the bike is participatory, right? You know how to do it because you participate in it, and that gives you the idea of how it works, right? And then, but it's very embodied, obviously. Like, you can't ride a bike in your head the same way you ride a bike in reality. With propositions, though, you can sort of just state things. And a lot of our knowledge is propositional. A lot of what we think of as knowledge is propositional. And then we equate that to power. And the problem is, as I pointed out in my power video, power doesn't work the way people say it does. They use power a lot of different ways, and it's a ridiculous conception. And so one thing knowledge doesn't give us at all is any conception of power whatsoever. Like, knowing more things doesn't actually help you in the world necessarily. It can, but it doesn't. And that's why you see weird things that don't make any sense under the knowledge is power paradigm, right? So if you're thinking the world is knowledge, is power, and that's like a rule or a formula or a reality that we're stuck with, then consider this. most of the self-made millionaires in the United States didn't graduate college. Some of them never went. In fact, almost half of them, I believe, never even went to a college. So if you think wealthy people are powerful and half of them didn't go to college, then that would kind of destroy the knowledge is power theory right there, just all by itself. Done. If we're using science, the scientific method, then that one fact, boom, you're done. There are other reasons why knowledge isn't power. It's an odd thing. Maybe not a lot of people know this, but if you engage with farming at all, you'll realize very quickly in talking to actual farmers or in talking to people who know farmers, the things they write in books and talk about in classrooms about farming will not help you farm correctly at all. When they make these proclamations, they are typically horrifically incorrect because it turns out farming is very participatory and you have to learn how to do it by doing it, experiencing it, and knowing things about nature, because it turns out, apparently unbeknownst to anybody who works in a lab or goes to a school, that where you farm makes all the difference in the world. So you couldn't say, here's a farming technique A, and you can use this to farm, because farming's drastically different, say, in the hills of the Andes, where they actually did farm, by the way, which we couldn't figure out for years because we scienced it. Knowledge doesn't really tell us what we think it tells us, is different from the plains, which is different from anywhere in the US. And all the different parts of the US, farming's different. So there's all sorts of uses for land and ways to use land. And raising cattle in New England is not like raising cattle in the Midwest. And different parts of the Midwest aren't like raising cattle in the other parts of the Midwest. It's very confusing. And I'm not saying there isn't knowledge there and you can't get it, but because of this idea that there's this knowledge and it's universal, and when we know it, we'll have some control, which is usually what they mean when they say knowledge is power, knowledge is control, over something that's deeply wrong most of the time. Now, where knowledge works is in very specific controlled circumstances, which is what science specializes in. Science specializes in controlled circumstances. In science, if you're implementing the scientific method properly, what you end up with is you're going to control for as many variables as possible and change as few variables as you can, and including controlling time, right, or rate of change over time, which is roughly the same thing, not exactly, but pretty close. And so, yet knowledge is useful there. Unfortunately, that can't be brought out of the lab at all. Some of the lessons learned from it can be helpful outside of the lab, but that's not the same thing. In one instance, you have control and you're gaining knowledge through the use of control. In the other instance, if you're saying knowledge is control, or like I said, they're using power, they mean control. Knowledge is control, then you're wrong. It's not outside of the lab, and it's the control that gets you the knowledge, not the other way around. Which isn't to say you can't use knowledge to get control of things. You can. But those are slightly different statements, and that's the problem. If you assume that once you have knowledge, you have control, you're wrong. Knowledge doesn't give you anything at all, roughly speaking, because knowledge is useless unless and until enacted. So in other words, the man who knows everything but does nothing has no impact on the world and dies not having added any value to the universe. That's kind of important to know. But the man who does random things will eventually stumble across something good, and those good things will cohere and be better. And even if everything they do is bad, at least you'll be able to see that their things don't work. They've added a lot more value to the world. Now, it's an extreme case. It's not real. I get it, but it points to a deep asymmetry. And you should pay attention to asymmetries. Nassim Taleb talks about this a lot. Read all his books. I say it all the time. Read all his books. Fooled by Randomness, great. Black Swan, wonderful. What's the next one? Anti-Fragile, Skin in the Game. Oh, read Bed of Procrustes, great stuff. Aphorisms, which are maxims, all great stuff. Read all that stuff. These asymmetries point us in a direction, right? So you've got the asymmetry of having knowledge versus doing things without knowledge. Doing things without knowledge turns out to be valuable, but only having knowledge turns out to not have any value. And so that points us in the direction, right? It says, like, well, why are these uneducated people becoming millionaires? Because it doesn't take the type of knowledge they teach in schools. It may take some knowledge. It doesn't take the type that's taught in schools to become a millionaire, obviously. Otherwise, it couldn't be that way. So fair enough. What does that mean? Well, there's lots of types of knowledge. One way to get knowledge, and maybe you can't talk about this kind of knowledge, again, is participation in things. Like when you do things, you learn things. When you farm, you learn things. You farm year after year after year, you learn things. Those things you may not be able to articulate. It may not be knowledge that you can pass on at all. Most likely you can pass it on to some people. There's a long, long tradition of this in the East still today, but somewhat in the West as well, where the master is doing something, the student comes in, they don't talk. Why? Well, because talking, communicating knowledge through reading, talking, writing, any of these methods can be detrimental to learning by watching, learning by mimicking, right? The mirror neurons, I see what you're doing, I do what you're doing. That kind of learning has very little overlap with learning that you do by speaking, and they activate different parts of the brain. This is in the cog-sci, right? I'm not making anything up. This is all stuff I've read about in the cog-sci, and it's well accepted to the best of my knowledge. So there's different ways of having this knowledge, and having knowledge that you get by watching somebody, by mimicking someone's behavior, is much more powerful, because that's how you learn how to ride a bike better, is you watch somebody ride a bike, especially somebody new who's a little unsteady, and then you see that it can be done, and that gives you confidence that if they can do it, you can do it, right? And you get an idea for what it is they're doing, because if you watch closely enough, you can see somebody balance on a bicycle. I can't describe to you how to balance. I can use the word balance, but that's not sufficient. Balance, now, do it. That doesn't make any sense, and it doesn't work. Not to say it isn't helpful, but it doesn't work. It's not a reliable, consistent result that we can use. It has some value. It just doesn't have enough value. It doesn't have enough power by itself, if you want to phrase it that way. The knowledge of doing it is more interesting, is more significant. And then there's different types of knowledge. We can't convey them all the same way. So that's already problematic for knowledge as power. And more knowledge should be better, because knowledge is control, power or control. Except that's not true either. The problem with knowledge is that you have to keep track of it. And it has to be useful in a context that you're in. So for example, if I have heavy knowledge of computers and I'm flying a plane, that's not as useful as you might think. Most of the things you need to know to fly the plane have nothing to do with how to program a computer. Not to say learning how to program a computer is not helpful. It is, especially if you're going to do it. But it won't help you as much with flying a plane as, say, knowledge of how to fly a plane. And so I still have to track these pieces of knowledge, and they still have to work in the conditions that I'm in. And the more knowledge I have, the harder it is to track. I don't care how good your memory is. Eventually, your memory is going to run out, or it's going to take longer to remember things, or whatever. So that's not necessarily helpful. What you want to have is the most important knowledge for the situations you're most likely to be part of, and any situation where there's an emergency thing you need to know. Like, you should know the Heimlich maneuver, right? You should know the signs of a heart attack. You should know the signs of a stroke. You should know the signs of deep vein thrombosis. These are important things to know. There's a bunch of little things, right, that are just sort of general, we need to know. You should know that if all the water at the beach pulls out very suddenly, you need to get the hell off the beach, right? There are little things you need to know. And if you don't know those things, you can run into trouble. But you know what? You're not going to know them all anyway. But what you can't know is all of physics, all of chemistry, all of computers, all of how to fly, right? You can't know all the knowledge in all the domains. And so your power or control in those limited domains, in those domains, is going to be limited. But that's also okay. We need to be okay with the ambiguity, with not having all this knowledge. Because when we conflate knowledge and control, or knowledge and power, we want more, and we can't track it all. And then we get confused and we get easily hijacked. People can confuse us. They can say, look at all this wonderful knowledge I have. And now let me tell you about this other thing that maybe I know nothing about. But I've spun you a good story and bang, you're in. Just like that. Oh, this guy knows physics, so he must know something about how to fly a plane. Yeah, maybe not. Maybe, but that would be independent of the knowledge of physics. There's lots of instances of physicists actually trying to fly and not actually being able to. And they can't even agree on physics, so let's be realistic. How knowledgeable are you if your field doesn't cohere enough to agree on some of these more important aspects of it? Not that I use that as a measure, but science does. And the idea that knowledge is power certainly uses that, because once you start questioning, well, what's good knowledge versus what's bad knowledge, now you're in a mess. And I don't even want to go into that, but I've mentioned it. Now you're in a mess. Good knowledge, bad knowledge, I don't know. Could be. Hard to say. Now we're in the judgment game. That always gets messy. So these are things you have to watch out for when thinking about knowledge. And this assumption that knowledge is somehow power, that knowledge gives us immunity, and that more knowledge is better is so baked in we don't even notice it. So there's a lot of instances that I hear where people go, well, I know something about psychology, and therefore I'm not prone to that type of psychology or psychological trick or cognitive bias. A lot of people go, oh, well, yeah, I know about that cognitive bias, as though once you know about it, you're protected from ever having it or something. It's not a virus that is repelled by your information in your head, right? So the fact that you know something doesn't mean much necessarily, because your knowledge could be wrong. You could be using it in the wrong way. It could just not apply, but you're mistaken about applying it. And you could say, well, the knowledge of how to apply knowledge is also knowledge. We could get into that crazy game, but I don't see the point. You could still be wrong about both types of knowledge, and that would have the same effect as what I said, which is wrong about when to apply it. So there's lots of ways that this idea sort of grabs us. The number of people that I hear talk about, oh, well, I'm well aware of hindsight bias, and I do my best to avoid it. And then you ask them what they do to avoid it, and they have no answer. And that's because they don't avoid it. They just know about it. And they think that knowing about it allows them to be immune from it. But that isn't how the world works. Sad for them, sad for me, sad for you, sad for all of us. Knowledge doesn't give us the type of control, self-control or otherwise, that we'd like to think. And this is why a lot of people will engage with something like Buddhism and go, oh, Buddhism, meditation, good. And then they'll learn to meditate. Well, I know how to meditate. And then they're done. They never meditate again. This happens a lot. This happens a lot. People are like, oh, okay, well, I know the thing now. And for some people, that's because they get bored once they know something can be done. And for other people, it's because they have this idea that knowledge is immunity from something. Whereas knowledge plus action, maybe, and not all the time, not reliably, not consistently. Knowledge plus action, maybe. But a lot of cases, knowledge needs to be put into action a lot, right? You need to keep doing things. Meditation in particular, you need to keep meditating. And the number of people that will keep meditating every day is not high. It's a very low percentage. But it turns out the number of people that will keep doing the same thing day after day, even if they know it helps them or believe that it helps them, is fairly low. It's very depressing. It makes me cry. It's just sad. But it's true. And we need to understand that knowledge is not the key to these things. I'm not saying knowledge is bad. I'm not saying knowledge isn't helpful. I'm not saying don't go seek knowledge. I'm saying be careful what knowledge you seek. Be careful how much you get. Be sure that if you have knowledge, that it's useful to you. Because there's a limited amount of knowledge you can hold. There's a limited amount of knowledge I can hold. That goes up and down based on how well I'm feeling in a given moment, not just in the given day. How close is it to lunch? Well known, right? Like, oh, talk to people after lunch. They're happier. Yes, they also have better memories. There's all these little things that knowledge isn't helping us with, that we're kind of assuming baked into the culture it is. And then we get fooled, right? We look at somebody and go, that guy's wicked knowledgeable. Look at all the stuff he knows. And therefore, I should listen more to his stuff. Maybe not. First of all, again, how do you know their knowledge is any good at all? They might be bullshitting you. That can happen. How do you know you're not bullshitting yourself about how smart they are? That happens all the time too. How do you know that they gave you knowledge? Because a lot of times charlatans will sound smart, but they're not smart. They're saying things that don't make sense. But if you're not sharp enough to catch it, and fair enough, maybe you're not, like maybe I'm not, that happens all the time, you'll get fooled, and that's no good. And once you assume knowledge is power, if you see somebody knowledgeable, you assume they have this power, this control, whatever it is. What if they don't? Like, that's not good. You don't want to be in that situation. And so this knowledge is power assumption is deeply baked in. It's deeply baked in, and we've got to really watch for it and try every day, you know, to figure out, like, am I making this mistake? Am I looking at knowledge as power? Did I see somebody smart and then assume they had some control or some ability that maybe they don't have or shouldn't have, or it makes no sense for them to have? Because this happens all the time. And it's a big problem too, because the people that do this get caught up in their own celebrity, right? And then the next thing you know, they think they're smarter than they are, and that's just bad for everybody. And they try to do things in the world, and those things fail because inevitably knowledge doesn't sustain things succeeding in the world. Knowledge can only get you so far, and it's not very. It can set you up for success, but it's the participation, it's the doing, it's the pragmatic side that makes success, that makes things work, that makes things go, right? That gives you immunity from things, or if not immunity, the ability to see them and correct, right? And correction of your knowledge or correction of your perceived knowledge is an important bias, right? That's a well-known effect, right? Where the Gell-Mann effect, where people think they're much smarter than they are. I think that's what it's called. And they're just not, right? People aren't that smart, or at least they're not as smart as they'd like to be. I know I'm not, thank goodness. It's good to have new things to learn. And that's what's important. You don't want to get fooled by these people, because you'll fool them too, and you'll both believe the lie. Then you'll both be in a bad situation. So look out for knowledge as power. Knowledge is not power. Knowledge is not control. Knowledge is not even as significant as you think. More knowledge is not better necessarily. It can be, but not usually. Usually it's just more garbage filling up your brain that you need and can use for better things. Lots of knowledge you can't get from a book. You can't get from a person. You can't get from an explanation. You can't get from a conversation, right? You can only get this kind of knowledge by doing things in the world actively. And there's lots of types of knowledge like that. Like, conversing with somebody is a skill and a type of knowledge, maybe, right? Or involves types of knowledge. But I can't give it to you in a book. It doesn't work very well. I'm not saying, you know, it's not useful. I'm saying that it doesn't have that whopping outlier effect that we think it should. Like, oh, I'm going to read a book on conversation. I'm going to have great conversations with people. No, you're not. What you need to do is watch lots of conversations with people, and then try to have lots of conversations with people to adjust your own, you know, way of doing things. You'll hear people say this a lot, like, oh, I got into this conversation and then I thought I was making a point and the other person didn't understand at all. Yeah, most people are inarticulate. That happens. Most people are inarticulate, completely inarticulate. Most people. That's not bad. It just means they need to figure it out and talk through things more. That's why I tend to let people talk when I can, when they're not saying something obviously wrong, right? When I don't think they're off track, but they're just confused and working things through. You gotta let them talk, right? And they may use 20 words to say one word, and that happens, but they need the time, right, to think about things. And that's why, even if you have the knowledge, if you can't convey the knowledge, it certainly has less utility. It's less valuable. So just having knowledge isn't as good as having knowledge and being able to articulate that knowledge. And embodied knowledge, like that participatory knowledge, may not be easily or even practically articulable at all. That's why we need to do things. That's why pragmatism is good, and pragmatism teaches you why things don't work when you implement them. Because every idea in your head is awesome. Every idea in your head will work. Why? The things in our head we have total control over. The things in the real world, we do not. We have limited control over the material world. We have infinite control over the imaginary world. That's what we have infinite control. Everything works as an idea. Everything. In the real world, most ideas fail completely and quickly, if you're willing to see it. And that's another bias. We think because we know something, when the outcome isn't what we expect, that it wasn't that what we knew was wrong. But sometimes when the outcome isn't what you expect, it's because what you know is wrong. And that's good to know. And the most important thing to know, at least for my purposes in this video, is that you've made it all the way through the video and that you've given me the thing that I am most grateful for, which is your time and attention.